You'll now learn how to build a front-end interface using the APIs provided by Gramix. A low-code platform lets you write your own code apart from giving you an interface to configure existing components. And the advantages of this are primarily that A, you can extend the application in any way that you want. And B, this allows people with specific skills to focus on the areas that they're experts at while using the no code aspect, that is just a configuration, to fill in the gaps in their knowledge. In this particular section, you'll learn how you can build a front end by writing code in HTML and JavaScript using the regression API that Gramix has created. You don't need to know HTML or JavaScript to create and run this exercise. You're welcome to just follow along and modify the code to your convenience. If you are already familiar with HTML and JavaScript, then you're welcome to rewrite the code in any way that you find convenient. Let's explore how we can create an interface to make a prediction of these currency values. For that, we'll take a simple scenario where we are only predicting the Australian dollar based on the Brazilian real and using any one of these models. Since linear regression has a slightly lower accuracy and decision tree regressor has a higher accuracy, we will go for the decision tree regressor and we'll create an interface that's kind of like this, which allows us to predict the value of the Australian dollar from the Brazilian real. But rather than having to type a value, we'll make it a slider. To build this interface, we are going to explore the coding interface that you get when you click on editor. Let's click on editor now. That takes us to an interface that embeds Visual Studio Code with a variety of files. One of the files is index.html, and this file is what the homepage of the application is. If I go to this application, remove the /predict and go to the homepage, it says welcome to Gramix, which is exactly the text that's mentioned here. Let me change this to predict AUD, and it auto saves in a few seconds. So when I reload this, it becomes predict AUD. What we'll do is replace this learn more button with an input. Inputs come in various types. One of those types is a range, and this shows an input like this where I can move the slider. What we want is as we move the slider, the value of the Brazilian real should change and it should fetch the results and get the value of the BRL. Let's look at how we can do that. First, we will add a few attributes to this input. We'll begin by saying the minimum value is, what are the minimum values of the BRL? From the data, we can see that BRL can be as low as 0.43. Or it can go as high as 0.44. Let's be generous and say that it can vary between 0.43 to a max, or well, even 0.40 to a max of 0.50 at a step of 0.001. So it can be 0.434, 0.435, etc. Let's also give this a name or an identifier. We'll call it BRL. So the net impact is that when we go to this page and start moving it, it will move in steps of 0.001 from the lowest value to the highest value, which is not yet displayed, but that's something that we're going to do next. What we'll do next is detect changes in the value of the BRL and see what that value is on screen. For this, let's place it on screen in, let's say, a big heading called result. So that is going to look like this. Let's give it a name, ID equals result, so that we can refer to it. Now we're going to write some JavaScript. You don't need to know JavaScript, just follow along to get a sense of how code can create a user interface. What we'll do is get the BRL element first. So that's document.query selector. That's how we select an element. Notice the capital S, everything else is small. Then we say hash. Hash indicates the identifier. We are going to be referring to this element BRL with the ID hash BRL. So that gets us that input. We'll assign it to a variable. Now, BRL.value is what actually contains the value, and we're going to display it on the screen where the result is. So let's say document.query query selector of hash result. And this has a text content which is equal to brl dot value. So what that does is gets this input and sets the result based on the value. Let's check that out. I'm going to reload this page and it sets a value of 0.45. But what we now need to do is whenever this value changes, it should automatically rewrite that text. So let's make that change. We'll say brl dot add an event listener. For any input event, an input event is sent when there is any change, which gives us an event. E right arrow in braces means that we take an event object and do the following. We want to do exactly the same thing that we did earlier, which is take the result, take the text content, and make that the same as the real's value. So let's reload. When we make a change, this automatically smoothly changes. Let's go a step further. And as we make these changes, let us send a request to the model, make a prediction for the Australian dollar, and show the result. For this, what we do is when there is a change in the input, we will fetch a particular URL. We'll say fetch of, I'm going to use backticks. Anything inside backticks is just a string, but you can use variables here. We need to fetch from /predict question mark BRL equals the value of BRL dot value. Anything inside dollar and braces will be converted into an actual string. For example, if I look at /predict question mark BRL equals 0.34, that gives me a value of BRL 0.34 corresponding to an AUD of 0.8996. If I say 0.59, that gives me a different prediction for the Australian dollar. I made a mistake. BRL should have been in capitals. So let me change this to capital BRL. This is case sensitive. Now the fetch function will actually send a request and then get a response. What I should do when I get the response is dot then do something. The response is in a string, but it needs to be converted to JSON first. So I will take the response, we'll call it as a variable R, put in the arrow to create a function, and then say get me the value of r.json, open bracket, close bracket. That's a function. So it takes the response, calls the function that returns the JSON value. And then once I have the JSON value, let's call this value, I can do whatever I want with it, such as putting in the contents here. We've already placed the BRL value. We also want to place this new value that's returned. So we can do that by putting it as a string like this. BRL value, let's just say equal to dollar of value. And let's make that clear. So many BRL equals so many AUD. Let's look at this output first, and then we'll come back to the code and take a look at it in a little more detail. When I go to the home page and rerun this, as I move this, it says 0.492 BRL is some object AUD. Now the reason it's showing some object is because /predict question mark BRL is equal to something is not just returning the value of the Australian dollar. It's actually returning an array in which the first element has a key called AUD. So what I really need to show here is not value, but value of 0, that is the first element, dot AUD. And that is what will give us the value here in the home page. So let's rerun, change, and yeah, now it says if I have a 0.42 BRL, then it's 0.8973 AUD. And as I move this value, it smoothly changes the output. And you can see that beyond a certain point, let's say beyond 0.47, it seems to have flattened and the AUD doesn't seem to increase. Maybe that is because we don't have data beyond this. Maybe that is because it actually is flattening out. We don't really know. So this is something that's a function of the model and the data. Keep that in mind. Let's change our model a bit. Rather than predicting using just one value, let's predict using 3 values: the Canadian dollar, Swiss franc, actually 4 values, and the Chinese yuan. Now, If I train the model, I get 100% accuracy. Let's go for linear regression. I may get a slightly lower accuracy, 0.93, but it's still not too bad. So now I need to pass 4 parameters, BRL, CAD, CHF, and CNY in order to make a prediction. Let's change our code to reflect that. We'll do this in the simplest possible way. What we'll do is copy paste all of these values 4 times. So for this one, I'll change this to capital BRL for consistency. Then we have CAD, and then we have CHF and CNY, CHF and CNY. And the values for these, well, they are in differing ranges, but I'm just going to give it a range from, let's say, 0 to, this goes up to 1.08, let's say 0 to 2. So there's no reason why we can't have really low values here and high values here in steps of 0.001 for these 4 currencies. Now, we have these 4 inputs. They're not labeled, so let's add labels for these. One way of doing that is by saying label against each one of these, and then wrapping that label with that input. And I'm going to copy this particular string in front. So it says BRL and CAD and so on right in front of those inputs. So I have a BRL that can change, I have a CAD that can change, I have a Swiss franc that can change, and a Chinese yuan that can change. The next thing is we will detect changes in all of these. So out here, now this is a capital BRL. There will be a CAD. There will be, let's call this CAD. Normally you'd be using arrays or loops for this, but my intent here is not as much to teach you how to write this code efficiently as just to show you a way of writing the code. Let's call this CNY and this is capital CNY. So now when any of these change, so for example, if BRL.add event listener of input, if this changes, then we need to run a function. Since the function is the same for all of them, I'll call this predict. So we are going to create a function predict, which does something, fetch the values, and we'll write this in a few minutes. This can be added to all of them, CAD. So whenever any of these changes, CNY, we will call the predict function. And what the predict function will do is get the value of not just BRL, but also CAD equals CAD dot value and CHF equals CHF dot value, and finally the Chinese yuan equals dollar of CNY dot value. So the full URL becomes something in the something along the lines of, let's go to /predict and make a prediction. We'll see that in the network tab, open in a new window. Yeah, it's calling BRL is equal to something, CAD equals something, CHF is equal to something, CNY equals something, which is what we have engineered here as the URL. The response still comes as a JSON like this, and we still want to pick the value of this and set the text content. Now, except that it's not just by showing a certain BRL, we want to show all the values, and it's getting a little too far to the right. So I'll put in braces so that we can add it to the next line. And the text content will be, let's say, text is equal to this string, and we'll assign it to the text. So that way that it's now more readable within the same code. So we'll say BRL so much, comma, CAD, dollar of CAD dot value, and comma, CHF, dollar of CHF dot value, comma, CNY, dollar of CNY dot value is equal to AUD so much. Let's see if this makes a prediction work. Go back to the home page and change any one of these. And yeah, it's making some predictions. Now it's saying that the Australian dollar could go as high as 36 if the Chinese yuan were 1 and so on. Now, This is making the predictions, but we probably want to start with initial values close to some realistic numbers. So let's specify the initial values. We'll take the first row as the default initial values. Australian dollar 0.897. Yeah. So okay, that actually doesn't matter. We need to take the Brazilian real 0.4347. Fine. BRL will say value is equal to 0.43. Close enough. The value for CAD is 0.96, 1.08. Value is equal to 0.96 and value equals 1.08. And for CNY 0.16. Okay. Value is equal to 0.16. Now with this, let's reload the page. Now we don't see the result when the page loads. So what we'll do is call the predict function once when the page loads. Predict, open bracket, close bracket, will now call the predict function. Run this and that gives us a default value of 0.8. Now from here, if I increase the Brazilian real, as the Brazilian real is increasing, we can see that the Australian dollar gently increases and we can see to what extent it increases as well. What if the Canadian dollar were increasing? Yeah, again, it gently increases and we can see the impact of that increase. Play around with any of these parameters and then see the net impact. Now you'll notice that as the Chinese yuan increases even a little bit, the Australian dollar has a dramatic change in value. What we've done now is created a front end using a coding interface, not a low code interface, but an actual coding interface to build a front end for the prediction that we're making using the machine learning handler, which was built using a low code interface.